You've reached the end of the paved roads. Here in the hollows, the shadows don't just move, they wait. You're about to hear the accounts of those who saw what lives beneath the roots and behind the porch lights. These are the forgotten records of the Appalachian Ridge, the stories that were never meant to leave the valley. Pull the covers up, lock the door, let the static take you. It's time to rest, if the woods let you. They say the oldest trees in the holler don't get their strength from the rain. They reach down for something else, something buried. When the floorboards started to groan in the middle of the night, we thought it was just the house settling. We were wrong. The roots were looking for a new place to rest. It is coming through the console again. It is coming through it is inside the housing. I can see it. I can see the tip of it just. It is finding the gap at the back of the terminal. It shouldn't be able to find anything. This room is sealed. The room is... Log note. The primary root tendril has breached Station 7. It has a diameter of approximately... It has the diameter of my wrist. It is the same color as a vein. I don't want to look at it anymore. I am not going to... That is not feedback. That is not the equipment. That is the tree. What you just heard was not a dramatization. That recording was recovered from a magnetic reel-to-reel unit found inside a decommissioned government installation located beneath the Chestnut Ridge of the Appalachian Highlands, in the southwestern corner of what federal documents refer to obliquely, always obliquely, as Zone 9. The file you are about to hear summarized was submitted to a congressional subcommittee in the spring of 1992 and subsequently classified under Executive Order 12,958, subsection C. It was not declassified. It was not reviewed. It was placed in a box. The box was placed in a building, and the building no longer appears on any map I have been able to locate. I am reading to you from a photocopy of that document. I will not say how I obtained it. I will tell you that the man who gave it to me told me he had not slept well in 4 years. He told me that sometimes, when the wind comes down off a wooded hill and moves through old timber, he still hears something in it. He is not wrong to. The file is designated Protocol Deep Root, case number 88B, and it begins, as so many terrible things do, with a very reasonable idea. The Chestnut Ridge in November is a particular kind of quiet. By late autumn, the leaves have come down from the red maples and the tulip poplars. The birches stand white and skeletal against the gray. The undergrowth has collapsed into itself. All that summer density reduced finally to brown matter and wet silence. You can see deep into the forest in November, and what you see mostly is absence. But on a particular bluff overlooking the Tug Fork River Valley, one tree does not participate in the seasonal withdrawal. The white oak, known in local records as the alderman, so named by a surveyor in 1791, who reportedly stood at its base, looked up through its crown, and felt, in his own words, as though I had interrupted something, was estimated at the time of the government's acquisition of the surrounding land in 1981 to be approximately 400 years old. It was 68 feet tall. Its crown spread 112 feet in diameter, and its root system, mapped by government geologists using ground-penetrating seismic equipment, extended in all directions for a lateral distance of nearly 300 feet, reaching depths of over 40 feet in places, threading through bedrock, finding water, finding dark. Beneath that root system, beginning in 1982, the federal government built Site 9. The facility was modest by the standards of the era. The primary briefing describes it as a signal research installation, language that in the bureaucratic lexicon of the early Reagan administration could mean almost anything, and in practice usually meant something that no one wanted to describe more specifically. Sublevel 1, Administration and Communications. Sublevel 2, Personnel Quarters and Laboratory Spaces. Sublevel 3, the Equipment Bays, the Generator Room, and what the schematics label simply as the Interface Chamber. The concrete was poured around the roots. Let me say that again so it settles properly. The geotechnical engineers did not reroute the root system. They did not attempt to sever it or reroute the building's footprint to avoid it. They designed the facility explicitly around the existing root architecture of the alderman oak, pouring the walls and floors in sections, accommodating the intrusions, sealing around the roots with a polymer compound, and continuing on. According to the project design rationale, and I am paraphrasing here from a document that uses words like novel bioconductive medium and naturally occurring signal propagation substrate, the roots of the alderman had demonstrated what the engineers called a remarkable electrical receptivity. The oak, in other words, could carry a signal. and so they decided to use it as one. The interior of Site 9, as described by personnel logs from the first year of operation, was precisely what you would expect from a mid-1980s federal installation built by people who had been told to be economical. The walls were poured concrete, unfinished, bare gray surfaces that wept condensation in the autumn and winter months, leaving long mineral streaks that the staff reportedly began, in private, to refer to as the weeping. The floors were institutional tile, cream-colored, scuffed from the first week. The overhead fixtures hummed at a frequency that several personnel noted in their medical logs interfered with their sleep. That frequency was 60 hertz, the frequency at which, as it turns out, certain biological tissues resonate sympathetically. Nobody flagged that as significant. Not then. Through the walls, visible in certain sections of the facility where the polymer ceiling had been applied in a thin coat, you could see them, the roots. They pressed against the concrete from the outside like slow, dark fingers. In the equipment bay on sub-level 3, where the ceiling was lower and the air always smelled faintly of damp earth, despite every filtration system running at full capacity, a section of primary root, approximately 8 inches in diameter, ran diagonally across the upper corner of the eastern wall, sealed, contained, catalogued in the facility logbook as Root Intrusion Section 7E, non-structural, benign. Benign. The project designated Deep Root was officially initiated in March of 1984. The working hypothesis was elegant, in the way that certain dangerous ideas are always elegant before you discover what they actually are. The research team, 6 scientists, 2 engineers, and a signals analyst on rotation from a facility in Maryland whose name appears in the file only as Station 12, believed they had identified a mycorrhizal signaling network of unusual complexity within the alderman's root system. Mycorrhizal networks are not unusual themselves. Any forester will tell you that the roots of trees communicate chemically through fungal threads, passing nutrients, passing warnings, passing something that is not quite information, but functions in its slow and primordial way like information. What was unusual about the alderman's network was the frequency range of its electrochemical activity. It fell, specifically, within a range that partially overlapped with the electromagnetic signatures produced by the human brain during deep sleep. The research team did not find this alarming. They found it interesting. There is a difference between those two responses, and the case file is a 400-page illustration of why that difference matters. By the summer of 1985, the team had succeeded in using the root network as what the file terms a passive bioantenna. They were transmitting low-frequency signals through the roots and recording what came back. What came back was described in the early reports as ambient biological noise, fragments of pattern, interference that resembled occasionally a rhythm. Then, in September of 1985, a technician named Raymond Folger filed what the case file calls an anomalous auditory report. He heard something in the ventilation system. Not the mechanical groan of the ductwork, which everyone heard and had cataloged and assigned maintenance tickets to and ignored. Not the settling of the concrete, which in a deep installation is a constant companion. What Folger described was a voice, not a clear voice, not words. He described it as, and this is a direct quotation from his incident report, a voice that is almost finished saying something, the way a word sounds in the half-second before you recognize what it is. He was the first to report it. He was not the last. By January of 1986, all 9 personnel at Site 9 had filed some variant of the anomalous auditory report. The ventilation was inspected. The ductwork was cleaned, resealed, re-inspected. The sounds continued. They were loudest, if louder is the right word for something that remained always just at the threshold of hearing. They were most present, most insistent, in the rooms closest to root intrusion section 7E. In the room closest to the root, a researcher named Dr. Adeze Okafor began keeping a supplementary log. She did not file this log through official channels. It was recovered from her personal effects. She wrote in her first entry, "The sound is not coming from the vents. The sound is coming from the root. I think I have known this for several weeks and not allowed myself to know it. Tonight I put my ear against the polymer seal over section 7E, and I could feel the vibration before I could hear it. It moved through the bone behind my ear. It felt very old. It felt like trying to remember something from before you had language for remembering." By April of 1986, 3 researchers had independently requested transfers. Their requests were denied. The denial memorandum, signed by someone identified in the file only as Project Oversight Tier 1, reads in full, "Request acknowledged. Transfer not approved at this time. Staff are reminded that Deep Root remains a classified, ongoing operation, and that lateral communication regarding project activities constitutes a federal security violation." It is a very short memo. It was clearly written by someone who had not spent a single night underground. The term that begins appearing in the internal communications starting in the summer of 1986 is encroachment. Not an intrusion, not a breach. Encroachment. The slow, incremental advance of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. Root sections that had been cataloged in previous surveys were no longer where the surveys said they were. The polymer seals, which had been rated for structural integrity over a 20-year period, were showing microfractures at multiple points, not from pressure, the engineers noted with some bewilderment, but from what appeared to be directional growth. The roots were not pressing outward blindly the way roots do. They were finding the gaps. They were following the gaps inward. Dr. Okafor's personal log from October 1986 contains an entry that I want to read to you carefully, because the language in it is specific, and it deserves the weight of specific language. She writes, "I examined my left forearm in the bathroom mirror this morning for 4 minutes before I understood what I was looking at. The vein on the interior of my wrist, the one that is always tracked slightly to the left as it approaches the elbow, has changed course. It now runs straight toward a discoloration that appeared 2 weeks ago, and that I have been telling myself is a bruise. It is not a bruise. The skin above it is slightly raised and slightly warm, and when I press it, there is something beneath it that does not feel like a vein. It feels more like bark." I am going to finish this entry, and then I am going to go back to the equipment bay, and I am going to listen to the root, and I think I already know what I will hear. I think I have known for a long time. I think the tree has been talking to us since before we turned on a single piece of equipment. I think we simply learned eventually to listen in the way it required. Site 9 was officially decommissioned in the spring of 1988. The decommissioning report, 4 paragraphs, bureaucratically immaculate, cites project completion and resource reallocation as the reasons for closure. It does not mention the personnel. Of the 9 staff assigned to Site 9 at the time of decommission, the case file accounts for 4. 2 were transferred, their subsequent assignments redacted. 1 was medically discharged and is noted as deceased, 1991, cause unspecified. 1, the signals analyst from Station 12, appears in a single follow-up document, a psychiatric evaluation, the conclusion of which has been blacked out so thoroughly that even the paper beneath it appears darker. Dr. Okafor is not mentioned in the decommissioning report at all. Dr. Mosswood, whose voice you heard at the beginning of this file, appears only as a name in an administrative appendix, listed under the header Personnel, Status Unresolved. Raymond Folger, the technician who first heard the voice in the ventilation system, the man who heard a word that was almost finished being said. Raymond Folger does not appear anywhere in the decommissioning documentation. He does not appear in any personnel records after March of 1987. His name occurs one final time in the case file, in a handwritten notation on an internal memo that was apparently never meant to be filed. The notation reads, Folger found in sub-level 3 junction corridor, unresponsive. Radiology indicates significant cortical changes. Origin unknown. Root tissue identified in subcutaneous sample, anterior left arm. Recommend immediate. The sentence does not finish. I have driven past the Chestnut Ridge twice since I received this document. You can see the alderman oak from the state road, if you know where to look. It stands on the bluff above the valley, alone now. The surrounding timber was cleared during the construction and never replanted. 400 years old by the last count any one official was willing to commit to. Likely older. White oaks of sufficient age begin to develop a bark texture unlike younger trees, gnarled and deeply furrowed. The ridges between the channels so sharp and pronounced that the surface begins to resemble something other than wood, something that the eye keeps trying to resolve into a more familiar shape. I did not stop the car. Both times I drove past, it was late afternoon, and the light was the particular low amber of an Appalachian autumn, and the shadows under the oak's crown were very deep and very still. And both times I had the windows down, and the air coming off the ridge had that smell, that cold, wet earth smell of deep soil and old root, and the particular darkness that lives 40 feet underground, where no light has ever reached, and no sound reaches either, except perhaps the slow electrical murmur of something 4 centuries old, sorting through the frequencies, learning to listen, learning to speak. Both times I drove past without stopping. I want to be very clear that it was a choice, that I chose actively not to stop. I want to be clear that it felt like a choice. The alderman oak was not removed following the decommissioning of Site 9. No public record of the facility's existence has been confirmed. The bluff on which the tree stands is listed in West Virginia County records as Federal Land Reserve, category unspecified. Access is discouraged. Dr. Claire Mosswood's final audio log, tape 88B, side 2, was never recovered. Some secrets are too heavy for paper. There was a man who spent his life collecting the stories no one wanted to tell. Stories that bled off the page. He realized too late that reading about the dark is like calling out to it. Now the only thing left to do is let the fire take the memories before they take us. It doesn't go up. That's the thing nobody put in the briefing. The smoke. It doesn't go up. It pools. It finds the corners first. And it starts to remember. The files aren't paper. They were never paper. His name was Elias Craw, 53 years old, retired federal archivist, widower. 30 years of patient custodial work, locating documents, processing them, disposing of them. The quiet administrative machinery of a government that generates more paper than it ever destroys. He had never been promoted, never been asked to testify, never assigned anything that couldn't be described in 3 words. Locate, process, dispose. The letter came on a Tuesday. Cream-colored envelope, no return address. The paper inside smelled of something old. Not quite mildew, not quite copper. Something that predated both. It told him his clearance had been retroactively elevated to Tier 7, custodial provisional. It told him the assignment was voluntary, but used language that made voluntary feel like a formality typed in out of legal habit. He was to report to a decommissioned ranger station near a ridge the locals called the Whispering Notch. He was to bring nothing personal. The work was simple. Locate, process, dispose. He drove 11 hours through country that got narrower and quieter with every mile, until the road stopped appearing on any map produced after 1971. He arrived at dusk. The ranger station was a concrete shell. The letter included a flat black key that opened a side door, which opened onto a staircase. Only down. 43 steps. He counted them. He would count them every day after that. The counting felt important, though he couldn't have said why. At the bottom, a stenciled door read, Sector 4, Records, Disposition, Authorized Personnel. Beneath it, in pencil, in handwriting that was very small and very careful, someone had added, Don't read them. He assumed it was a joke. He opened the door. The smell reached him before the light did. Ozone, old copper, and beneath those, something organic, not rot, something closer to a living thing kept too long in a sealed space. The way a greenhouse smells when ventilation fails. Warm and pressurized, almost breathing. He found the light switch. Fluorescent tubes flickered on one by one, revealing a long, low-ceilinged room, lead-lined, concrete-floored, sealed with something that gave the floor a faint, dark sheen, as though it had been lacquered with years of accumulated humidity. Along the left wall, the furnace, larger than he'd expected, industrial grade, government issue, 50s manufacture, cast iron door with a circular handle like a ship's wheel. Around its base, the concrete was stained in a wide, irregular ring. Not soot exactly. Something denser. Something that had dried where it settled rather than rising with the heat. He noted that, filed it away. The room had a quality he couldn't attribute to any single feature. A weight in the air, a pressure just below the threshold of discomfort. The kind of atmospheric density you find at the bottom of very deep water, or inside a room that has been sealed for a very long time. His ears did not pop. His breathing did not labor. But his body registered something, in the way a body registers the presence of something large and still in a dark place, before the mind has formed the thought. He stood in it for a moment. Then he moved. Along the right wall, 14 crates, wooden frames wrapped in waxed oilcloth, each stenciled with a lot number and a designation he didn't recognize. Dry records, organic substrate, lot. Every year range was blacked out. Every origin designation was blacked out. On the workbench beside the furnace sat a laminated instruction sheet. He read it under the fluorescent light. Open each lot in sequence. Transfer contents to the furnace using the provided implement. Do not read. Do not photograph. Do not attempt to identify subjects. Ensure complete combustion before proceeding to the next lot. When smoke begins to pool rather than rise, terminate the session. Seal the furnace door and wait. Resume after a minimum of 4 hours. He read that last line twice. When smoke begins to pool rather than rise. He set the sheet down. He looked at the dark ring staining the floor around the furnace base. He told himself, ventilation problem. The exhaust fan undersized. The smoke backed up. He told himself that while he got the furnace going, feeding it scraps of brown paper until the fire found its pace. A deep, rhythmic whomp, 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 like something large and patient breathing. He stood in front of it and let the heat press against his face. This is just work. Locate, process, dispose. He opened lot 1. The oilcloth was stiff but not brittle. He scored the wax seal with a penknife. The smell that emerged was dry and faintly warm, the way an old leather Bible smells when opened after years. Inside, the records were stacked flat, separated by tissue paper. He lifted the first one and held it under the work light. It was not paper. The knowledge arrived the way inconvenient truths arrive, not as a shock, but as a slow, unwilling acknowledgement of something already true before the mind was ready to admit it. The substrate was thin, translucent at the edges, pale, the color of old cream or the underside of a wrist. Its surface had a faint topographic quality, a slight irregularity that suggested the record had once been alive in a way that paper never is. The markings were dense and small, applied in brownish ink. Names, dates, grid coordinates, hand-drawn lines connecting names to coordinates in ways that followed no geographic logic. The lines moved like roads, or rivers, or something else entirely. Some of the names had been redacted, not with the clean black bars of a government stamp, but with the same brownish ink applied in dense, layered strokes, as though whoever had made the redaction had been pressing down hard, pressing down the way you press on a wound. There were numbers in the margins that he didn't recognize as dates. There were symbols he didn't recognize as anything. In the lower right corner of the first record, very small, was a word that had not been redacted. A single word, written in a different hand than the rest, lighter, less deliberate, as though added quickly and without authorization. He did not read it. He folded his attention away from it the way you fold away the corner of a page you don't intend to return to. He called them skin maps later in the audio log. At the time, he called them unusual. He set the record on the shovel, walked to the furnace, opened the iron door. The heat hit him like a wall. He pushed the shovel in. The record curled, not quickly, not the way paper curls in a fast, eager panic, but slowly, deliberately, the edges drawing inward like fingers closing around something. And as it contracted, it seemed for a fraction of a second to resist. He noted that, filed it away. He closed the furnace door. He went back to the crate. The work settled into rhythm. This is what he focused on. Lift, carry, open, slide, wait, close. Lift, carry, open, slide, wait, close. The furnace was constant behind him. The fluorescents hummed their single endless note. The concrete was solid under his boots. He did not look closely at the markings. He was glad to comply with the instruction not to read. He cracked the furnace door to check the combustion. The record was burning, but the smoke was wrong. Normal smoke rises. It finds the upward draft and goes. That is the nature of smoke. This smoke descended. It emerged in slow threads, the color of black amber, the color of ancient tree resin. It coiled above the grate and then fell, pooling on the furnace floor in a slow, viscous layer, like something that understood gravity and was choosing deliberately to follow it. He watched it. He closed the furnace door. He looked at the dark ring on the concrete around the furnace base. He understood what had made it. He stood still for 3 minutes. He watched the clock's second hand make 3 full revolutions, and he focused on that, the ordinary mechanical sweep of it, because the alternative was to focus on something that was not ordinary and not mechanical. Then he went back to work. The instructions had accounted for this. Someone had stood here before him, had seen this, and had survived long enough to write the protocol down. He found that comforting in the specific and limited way that evidence of prior survival is comforting. He opened the furnace to add the next record. The smoke had pooled to the door's base and was seeping out in a slow, deliberate thread, feeling across the sealed concrete like something exploring with a single, curious finger. It was not shapeless. It had preferences. It filled the low places first. It moved with a consideration that he could not explain and chose not to examine. He heard it on the 4th record of Lot 3. Not words, a texture in the burning sound, something beneath the furnace roar, below the metallic tick of cooling iron, occupying the frequency between sound and feeling. He opened the furnace door and leaned in despite himself, because that is the particular cruelty of whispers. They require you to move toward them. The record was burning, curling inward, and as it contracted, as the markings blackened and the edges drew to center, the sound clarified. The record was saying its own name. He understood this without wanting to. The whisper had no clear syllables he could write down, but it carried the particular weight and shape of an identity, the sound a person makes in sleep when dreaming of themselves. He closed the furnace door. He stepped back. The smoke on the floor had reached the workbench. In the far corner, the accumulated vapor had begun to suggest a shape. Nothing defined, nothing he could point to and name, just a density, an organization, a center from which the smoke distributed itself with a kind of direction that random dispersion does not have. He thought of the names on the records, the names beneath the redactions. He put the next record in. In the corner, the shape had grown slightly more specific. It had a vertical axis, something like a head, something like shoulders. It did not move. It simply was, with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time for a fire to bring it back. He became aware, standing there, that there was a second shape forming, not in the same corner, along the base of the crates, where the smoke had pooled deepest, where the oilcloth draped low and the shadows were thickest. A different density, a different center, smaller, or perhaps only further away, in the way that perspective makes things seem small when they are simply at a distance. He did not count the shapes. He felt with some certainty that counting them would be a mistake, that counting them would mean he had accepted they were there, and that acceptance was a door he was not yet prepared to walk through. He kept his eyes on the furnace, on the iron door, on the circular handle like a ship's wheel, on the ordinary mechanical fact of it. The ventilation grate was in the ceiling, centered above the furnace. He had assumed it was exhaust ventilation. He noticed now that the louvers were angled the wrong way, not outward, designed to direct air into the room, designed specifically to allow a view from above. He stared at it. He raised one hand slowly, in a gesture that was not quite a wave. Nothing happened, but he kept his eyes on it a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment he understood something the cream-colored letter had not mentioned. He was not here to burn the records because the records were dangerous. He was here because someone needed to know what happened when they burned. He was not the archivist. He was the experiment. The thought arrived without drama. It settled into him the way cold settles into a room, not all at once, but pervasively, finding every corner. He set down the shovel. He stood in the center of the room. The smoke covered a third of the floor. It moved in slow, unhurried currents. In the far corner, the shape was more specific than before, and he understood, standing there, what the records actually were. They were not documentation of people. They were the people. Whatever the government had done, in the years whose dates were all redacted, in the place whose name was blacked out on every crate, whatever had been collected and pressed and dried and wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a lead-lined room beneath a mountain, these were not records about the subjects. These were the subjects, reduced, compressed, held in the only way they could still be held. And when you burned them, you did not destroy them. You released them. He set the shovel parallel to the workbench. He removed the welding gloves and folded them on top of it. He walked to the staircase door, and he put his hand on the handle, and he paused. Behind him, the furnace breathed its low, patient heartbeat. Behind him, the smoke moved in its slow currents, and from somewhere in the black amber pooling across the floor, from somewhere in the shapes accumulating in the corners, he heard something. Not with his ears, behind his sternum, the way you feel a door close in another part of a building, a vibration reaching you through the structure of things. One word: stay. He opened the door. He climbed 43 stairs. He counted every one. He pushed out into mountain night, cold, wide, full of ordinary darkness. He stood in the smell of pine and stone and listened to wind move through the ridge. He drove 11 miles before he stopped, engine running for the heat. He held his phone and pressed record and talked until the words ran out. The smoke doesn't go up. That's the thing nobody put in the briefing. He stopped recording. He sat with the engine running. After a while, the air inside the car began to smell of ozone and copper and something older than both. He looked in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, the dark was denser than it should have been. It had a shape. It had followed him. Up 43 stairs and 11 miles of mountain road, the way smoke follows a draft, the way a name follows the person who carries it, the way the dead follow the ones who were asked in cream-colored envelopes to burn them. He adjusted the mirror. He drove. The dark in the back seat shifted with the curves of the road, always finding its center, always settling, patient, amber black, and quiet. At a gas station in the valley, a woman at the next pump looked at his car, looked away, then looked back. She moved her children to the far side of her vehicle without saying a word. He paid for the gas. He got back in the car. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The gas station's fluorescent canopy threw a flat white light across the windshield, and in that light, in the reflection, he could see himself, an unremarkable man of 53, tired-looking, still wearing the government-issue respirator around his neck like a talisman he hadn't thought to remove. He looked like what he was, a custodian, a man whose job was to tend to things other people didn't want to think about. He looked at the back seat in the mirror. The shape waited there, patient and amber black. He looked away. Somewhere on a 2-lane highway, mountains on both sides, no lights for 30 miles in any direction, he felt it again. Behind his sternum. One word. Stay. He turned up the radio. He drove east. Nature has a way of folding in on itself when no one is looking. A group of hikers found a spot that wasn't on any map. A perfectly gray clearing where the birds didn't sing. They set up camp thinking they'd found peace. But in the mountains, if a place feels empty, it's usually because something has cleared the way for a meal. It's not. The trees don't go all the way down. I put my hand through the bark and it's drywall. It smells like a hospital. There's a hallway behind the pine trees. There's a fluorescent light on in the hallway, and there's a clipboard on the floor, and I can see my name on it, and I can see numbers. I think those are my numbers. I think that's my heart. Now, you settle in. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Let me tell you about a man named Leo and a campsite he found on a map that was never supposed to be shared with anybody. And I want you to understand, before we get into any of it, that Leo was not a foolish man. He was not the kind of man who wandered off trails without knowing where he was going. He was not the kind of man who ignored warnings printed in bold red letters at the top of a document. He was, however, the kind of man who convinced himself that the warnings were for other people. Most of us are. There are rules to the Appalachian woods. Not the kind you'll find printed on a laminated card at the ranger station, though those exist too. About bear canisters and fire rings and not feeding the wildlife. Those are sensible rules. I'm talking about the other kind. The kind passed between people who've spent real time out in those hills. The kind you learn by listening. The first rule is that the woods have a sound. And if that sound ever stops, if the crickets go quiet, if the frogs stop their calling, if even the wind seems to hold its breath, you stop too. You don't move. You wait. Because something made everything else go quiet. And you want to know what that something is before you go stumbling toward it. The second rule is about birds. Birds in the Appalachians are a kind of living compass. Where birds fly, air moves. Where air moves, the land breathes. A hollow without birds flying over it is a hollow that nature has quietly decided to leave alone. Old-timers call it a dead ceiling. You camp under a dead ceiling long enough, they say, and you start to feel like something is pressing down on you from above. Like the sky is lower than it ought to be. The third rule, and this one matters for what happened to Leo, is about maps. A map of the Monongahela National Forest that looks right but feels wrong is more dangerous than no map at all. The The forest is old enough and deep enough that cartographers have made mistakes. And some of those mistakes have been standing in ink for 100 years. If a trail on a map doesn't appear on 3 separate maps, some old men will tell you, don't walk it. If a campsite appears on only one map, one single document, and there's no other record of it anywhere, you leave it alone. Leo knew all 3 of these rules. He'd been camping in the Monongahela since he was 11 years old, following his uncle through hollows that didn't have names yet, sleeping under skies so clear and black and heavy with stars that they felt almost architectural. He knew the smell of rain on quartzite. He knew the sound a creek makes when it's running over shale versus limestone. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of person who should have known better. And still, the map came to him through a forum, one of those old internet places, the kind with a dark background and white text, and a community that had been quietly talking to itself since the early 2000s. A thread titled Hidden Gems, Mon Forest, Off-Grid Sites, No Permit Required. Most of the thread was ordinary enough, fire roads and dispersed camping areas, places where the cell service was good enough to download a podcast before you lost signal entirely. But about 40 posts down, someone with a username that was just a string of numbers had posted a scan of a document. Government letterhead, United States Forest Service, it said at the top. And then below that, in a font that looked slightly different from the rest of the document, like it had been added later by a different printer. Recreational Use Supplement, Classified Site Registry, Appendix D. Most of the document was blacked out, thick black bars across every line of text, the kind of redaction you see on FOIA documents, the kind that suggests someone went through with a very wide marker and a very thorough hand. But in the middle of the page, one section had been left visible. Whether by accident or by design, Leo couldn't say. It showed a topographic area, a clearing, coordinates printed in small type. And in the center of the clearing, rendered as a small gray square on the map, a notation that read, Concrete Platform, 20 feet by 20 feet, designated Rest Area. See Appendix F. Appendix F was entirely blacked out. At the very top of the document, in red ink, the word Classified had been stamped at an angle, the way those stamps always seem to land, like the person doing the stamping was in a mild hurry. Leo looked at that stamp for a long time, long enough that you'd think he was reconsidering. But what he was actually doing, if you'd asked him, was convincing himself it was old, that the classification was historical, that whatever government project had been associated with that clearing had been shut down decades ago, and the only thing left was a concrete slab that some bored federal employee had, in a moment of bureaucratic optimism, labeled a rest area. He wrote down the coordinates in a small orange notebook. He closed his laptop. He started packing his gear. He drove up on a Thursday, the kind of late September Thursday that the Appalachians do better than anywhere else on earth. The air cool and carrying that particular smell of dried leaves and creek water and something faintly mineral underneath, like the mountains themselves are exhaling. The road into the forest off Route 39 was one he'd taken before, though only as far as the main trailhead. Past that point, he was on a fire road, crushed gravel and two-track, the kind of road that exists to give Forest Service trucks access to places tourists aren't supposed to go. His headlights swept across the birch trees at the road's edge. They stood close together, white-barked and still, and in the moving light they looked briefly like people standing at attention. He drove slowly, not because the road required it, though it did, but because the Appalachians at dusk have a quality of compression, like the world is quietly folding inward. And moving too fast through that feeling has always seemed to Leo like an act of disrespect. The coordinates took him off the fire road entirely, onto something that wasn't quite a path and wasn't quite nothing. Compressed undergrowth, a kind of suggestion of passage. He parked where the suggestion ended and walked the last quarter mile with his pack and his headlamp. The clearing arrived suddenly, the way clearings in dense forest always do. One moment you're in the trees, and then you're simply not. And the sky opens up above you and feels enormous and close at the same time. The moon was 3/4 full. It was enough light to see the concrete slab at the center of the clearing, gray and smooth and absolutely, perfectly square, 20 feet by 20 feet. He paced it out, exactly right. He stood at the edge of it for a moment and looked up. No birds. Not the absence of birds that happens when it's late and the diurnal species have roosted. A different kind of absence. Structural almost. Like the air above the clearing had a ceiling to it, invisible and definitive, and the birds knew it was there and flew around it the way water flows around a stone. He noticed this. He filed it under interesting rather than alarming and set up his tent on the concrete slab because the ground around it was soft and uneven with roots, and the slab was flat and smooth and almost comfortable in its industrial plainness. He ate his dinner at the edge of the clearing, instant noodles from a titanium pot. The tree line was maybe 40 feet from the slab in every direction. and in the moonlight the pines at the edge looked particularly dark, particularly dense, the kind of darkness that has depth to it. He watched them while he ate, the way you watch a tree line when you're alone in the woods, not because you expect to see anything, but because it's good practice to know what the static looks like before something changes it. The crickets were loud, rhythmically loud, almost metronomically loud, he thought, and then decided that was just because he'd been spending too much time in cities where biological things had to compete with mechanical ones, and you started hearing rhythm in everything. He slept at 10:30. The concrete was harder than he'd expected through the tent floor, and the sleeping pad helped only somewhat. But he was tired from the drive and the walk and the particular good exhaustion that comes from a night in air that actually has oxygen in it, and he was asleep within minutes. He did not dream, or if he did, he didn't remember. What he remembered was waking up. It was 2 a.m. by his watch. He knew the time before he looked at it. Something had changed in the quality of the dark, in the texture of the silence, and his body had registered the change before his mind caught up. He lay still for a moment, the way you do when you're not sure what woke you, listening. And then he understood. The crickets had stopped. Not tapered off, not slowly gone quiet the way insects do as the temperature drops. Stopped. One moment they were there, rhythmic and atmospheric and constant. And the next moment, there was nothing. A silence so complete it had a pressure to it, like the inside of a sealed room. He unzipped his tent slowly. The clearing looked the same in the moonlight. The concrete slab, the tree line 40 feet in every direction, the sky above with its three-quarter moon. But something was wrong with the air. He could smell it before he could name it. Not the green, damp, faintly sweet smell of a September forest at night. Something else. Something sterile. Something that reminded him, in a way that didn't make any sense, of the inside of a dentist's office. That ozone and antiseptic smell. That smell of recycled air. He stood up on the slab and looked at the tree line. The trees were perfectly still. Not the stillness of a windless night, which has a quality of rest to it, a sense of held breath that will eventually release. This was a different stillness. Absolute. Unanimous. Every branch, every needle, every piece of loose bark on every trunk. Motionless in a way that felt less like calm and more like pause. Like someone had pressed a button. He walked toward the tree line slowly. He was not a man who scared easily, but he was a man who listened to his body and his body was doing something quiet and insistent that he recognized as fear without panic. The low, humming kind that lives in the stomach and makes your hands feel very far away. He reached out and touched the nearest pine. The bark was wrong. It looked right. It had the texture of bark, the graying brown of mature pine, the faint resinous smell that pines carry. But it was rigid in a way that wood isn't. Wood has give to it, a subtle biological yielding. This had none. It was like touching a plaster cast of a tree, like touching the idea of a tree rather than a tree itself. He pressed harder. His fingers went through the surface, not through the way your fingers go through rot or soft wood, through the way your fingers go through drywall. He pulled his hand back, looked at the white powder on his fingertips, fine, chalky, the color of a clean wall. He pushed the bark panel aside. It swung inward on a hinge he hadn't seen. Behind it was a hallway. Fluorescent lights, one of them flickering slightly, casting that particular institutional light that makes everything look like evidence. Linoleum floor, pale gray. Walls painted the color of nothing. The color that government buildings use when they want you to stop looking at the walls. The hallway went left and right, and there was no visible end in either direction. On the floor, just inside the opening, there was a clipboard. He reached in and picked it up. His hands were shaking now. The fine motor kind of trembling that happens when your nervous system has decided it's had enough of pretending nothing is wrong. He held the clipboard under the flickering light. It was a data log. Columns of numbers, time-stamped. The header read, Project Greenbrier, Participant Monitoring, Perceptual Immersion Study, Phase 3. Below that, the subject identification number. And below that, printed in standard government font, so ordinary it was almost insulting. Subject, Leo M. Caraway. Age, 34. Baseline heart rate, 62 beats per minute. And then the log. Every hour of the night recorded. His heart rate at 10:47 p.m. when he'd been eating his noodles. 68 beats per minute. His heart rate at 11:03 p.m. when he'd been lying in his tent trying to sleep. 59 beats per minute. His resting rate at 12:30 a.m., deep in sleep. 54 beats per minute. And at the bottom of the log, the most recent entry, time-stamped 2:04 a.m., written not in print, but in handwriting, the same pen that had presumably just set this clipboard on the floor moments before he found it. 2:04 a.m. Subject has breached the perimeter. Heart rate, 119 beats per minute. Recommended action. The recommended action was blacked out. A thick bar of ink, applied by someone who had apparently prepared for this possibility. Leo stood in the doorway between the hallway and the clearing, between the fluorescent light and the moonlight, and he held the clipboard with both hands. The flickering light made his shadow jump on the linoleum. Behind him, the clearing looked exactly as it had looked all evening. The concrete slab, the moon, the trees standing in their silent circle, the trees that were not trees. He thought about the map, the red classified stamp at its angle, Appendix F, blacked out entirely. He thought about the no birds and the metronomic crickets and the smell of recycled air that he'd noticed and filed away under interesting. He thought about how long he'd been asleep, how long the experiment had been running before tonight, whether tonight was the only night, or whether the coordinates had been waiting in that forum thread for a specific kind of person to find them. The kind of person who would convince himself the warning was for other people. He set the clipboard back down on the linoleum floor, very carefully, and stepped back into the clearing and let the bark panel swing shut behind him. The hallway disappeared. The tree was a tree again. He went back to his tent. He got inside. He zipped it closed. He did not sleep. At dawn, the birds came back as if they'd never left, calling from the tree line in ordinary, cheerful, biological voices. And the air smelled like pine and creek water and September. And his watch said 6:17 a.m., and somewhere in the forest a woodpecker was going about its business against a dead tree. And everything was exactly as it should be. His heart rate was 119 beats per minute. It stayed that way for a very long time. Sleep well now. Don't worry about the trees. In the high ridges, a porch-light isn't for the guests. It's a peace offering. It's the price you pay to keep the things in the tree line from stepping onto the wood. It's a simple rule. Keep the bulb burning until dawn. But bulbs break. And some things have been waiting a long time for a shadow to walk through. It's on the porch now. It isn't shadow. Shadow doesn't have weight. It doesn't make the boards. I left one light on. I just need it to be enough. Come on in now. Sit down where you are. Pull whatever covers you have up a little closer to your chin and let the room settle around you. You don't need to go anywhere tonight. You don't need to do a single thing except listen and breathe and let my voice carry you down into that long, quiet dark where the dreaming lives. My name doesn't matter much. People around here, the ones who still come to me, they call me the archivist. I keep records. I write down what happened in the hollows and on the ridges and along the creek beds where the county maps go thin and the road signs get swallowed by kudzu. I write it all down so that somebody, someday, might understand what this land asks of the people who live on it. Tonight, I want to tell you about a man named Elias. The file I have on him is labeled Case File 092. The county designation, before the county stopped keeping records of the affected area altogether, was Lux Hollow. A funny name for a place that became famous for its darkness. But that's what this land does. It names things true before you understand why. Elias came to Lux Hollow in the early part of October. The year doesn't matter. The season matters. The season always matters in the mountains. He had driven up from a city, one of those cities full of right angles and scheduled light, where the darkness is never allowed to settle properly, where the sky at night is a kind of bruised orange, and the stars are theoretical things you read about but rarely see. He had lived 41 years in that city, and he had grown tired of it in the way that people do. Not all at once, but slowly, the way a river carves a valley. One morning he woke up and the tiredness had simply become the shape of him. So he found the listing for a cabin on a ridge in a county he'd never heard of, in the part of the state where the mountains fold into themselves like sleeping animals. And he signed the papers, and he came. The cabin was old in the particular way that Appalachian structures are old. Not crumbling, not romantic, but dense. Dense with time. The logs had gone the color of iron, and the chinking between them had been repaired so many times it looked like a map of surgeries. The porch wrapped around 3 sides, and the boards were the color of old bone. The air up there, I want you to hold this now. The air up there smelled like damp pine resin and ozone and the faint mineral tang of cold creek water, even though the nearest creek was a 1/4 mile downhill. The cold came off the mountain above the cabin in slow, rolling waves, even in October, even before the first real frost. And it carried that smell with it like a gift, like a warning, like both. Elias breathed it in, standing in the gravel drive with his truck running and his hands in his coat pockets. And he thought this was the right choice. He was correct about that. He just didn't understand what the right choice would cost him. The first thing he really noticed, in the way that the body notices before the mind catches up, was the lights. Every other structure visible from his ridge was lit. Not warmly lit, not porch lamp lit, the way you might expect from mountain homes in the quiet hours. These lights were institutional. The nearest neighbor, a farmhouse perhaps 3/4 of a mile down the eastern slope, was ringed in floodlights the color of daylight. Tall industrial poles staked into the earth around the property's perimeter, burning white and absolute. Another house, further south, barely visible through the tree line, pulsed with a steady amber glow from what appeared to be sodium vapor lamps. Old ones, the kind that hum at a frequency you feel in your back teeth. There was a farmstead to the northwest. Elias could see the silhouette of it on the next ridge over. And it burned so many lights that on overcast nights, he would later write in his journal, the cloud cover above it had a faint, persistent blush, as if the farm were a small and determined city. He thought it was strange. He thought perhaps these were people afraid of coyotes, or of the particular paranoia that isolation breeds in certain temperaments. He did not think about it again for nearly 3 weeks. Now, before I tell you what happened on the night Elias made his error, I need to lay some older stone. The people who settled these specific ridges, not the county broadly, but these ridges, the ones that feed into Lux Hollow proper, came through the Cumberland Gap in the late 1700s, and they brought with them a knowledge that was neither fully superstition nor fully science, but the useful territory in between. They knew plants and roots. They knew the behavior of water. And they knew, or rather they had learned through terrible education over 2 or 3 generations, something particular about the nature of darkness in this elevation. The earliest journals, the ones I keep in the archive, are written in a cramped Scots-Irish hand, and they refer to the darkness of the hollow not as an absence of light, but as a presence, a substance. They called it the weight, or in a few cases that I find particularly striking, the glass dark, because of the way it moved. Not like shadow, which simply is wherever light is not, but like a very slow, very cold liquid, seeking low places, pooling against solid objects, pressing. They kept tallow candles burning on every sill, every window, every night from first dark until full dawn. Not for comfort, not for fear of the human kind of threat. They kept those candles burning the way you keep a levee intact, not because you're afraid of the water tonight, but because you understand what water, given time and opportunity, will do. When the tallow ran thin, they rendered bone fat. When bone fat was scarce, they burned pine knot torches and propped them against the outside walls. One journal entry, this one from a woman named Merritt, whose last name the record doesn't preserve, reads simply, "Let the light bill come due. Better we pay it than let the dark take its own interest." I have thought about that phrase for a long time. The Porch-Light Tax. The cost of living on this land is light. Not warmth, not noise, not salt at the threshold or iron above the door, the way other traditions handle other threats. Just light. Constant, unbroken, patient light. The settlers understood this. Their children understood it. Their children's children, who wired up the first electric lights in the 1930s and replaced their sodium lamps in fluorescence with something more reliable and more bright. They understood it too. It passed down, not as a story, but as a habit. The way you lock a door without thinking about why, because the body remembers, even when the mind has moved on. Elias had no body memory of this place. He had arrived from elsewhere, carrying elsewhere's habits. And on the 19th night of October, he flipped the breaker that killed the floodlights. He had been wanting to see the stars. That is the whole of it. There is no grander reason. He had driven 4 hours into the mountains partly for the sky, and every night since his arrival the floodlights on their bracket above the porch eave had washed the whole ridge in a flat industrial white that turned the sky a ceiling gray and swallowed every star above 15 degrees of elevation. He had called the power company twice about the bill. The lights were old. The previous tenant had installed them, or perhaps the one before, and they drew more current than he'd expected. So on the 19th night, after a dinner of canned soup and crackling radio, he went to the breaker box in the utility closet, and he flipped the switch. The floodlights went out. He stepped onto the porch, and the sky was extraordinary. That part is true, and it matters that it's true. The Milky Way lay across the mountain dark like something poured, like cream in cold water, and the air was sharp with that pine and ozone smell, and the cold came off the ridge in its slow, patient waves, and for approximately 11 minutes, Elias stood on that porch and felt, I think, a kind of happiness that was very close to peace. He noticed the cold first, Not the ambient cold of the mountain. He had dressed for that. But a specific cold, a directional cold. The way cold moves off a block of ice toward you when you open a freezer door. It was coming from the tree line. He looked toward the trees. The tree line was perhaps 40 yards from the porch railing. In the starlight, he could see the shapes of the pines, the gaps between them, the silver gray of the ground cover. He could see these things because there was enough light from the sky. But the shadows between the trees were moving, not swaying, not shifting the way shadows shift when a branch moves in wind. These were moving the way a tide moves, slowly, with intention, with the absolute patience of something that has been waiting for a very long time. He watched the shadow at the edge of the tree line thicken. This is the word he used in his journal, and I want you to hold it. Thicken. The way a broth thickens when heat is applied. The darkness between the outermost pines and the open ground of the yard became more concentrated, denser, until it had a visible edge, a clear and defined border between itself and the lesser dark of the open air. And then it began, very slowly, to cross that border. Elias did not run. He told me later, in one of only 3 conversations we had before the county rerouted the access road and effectively erased the ridge from the navigable map. He told me that he did not run because the movement was too slow for running to feel like the right response. Running is a reaction to speed, to threat that comes fast. This came like weather. The darkness crossed the yard in something close to 20 minutes. He stood and watched it the whole time. He told himself it was an optical illusion, a cloud bank, a change in his eyes adapting to the dark. He is an intelligent man, and intelligent people are very skilled at assembling explanations that allow them to remain still when every older, quieter part of them is screaming to move. The shadow reached the base of the porch steps. The temperature on the porch dropped perhaps 15 degrees in the space of 30 seconds. He saw his breath. He had not been able to see his breath before. And then he heard the boards, the porch boards beneath the shadow's leading edge, not beneath his feet, but at the far end of the porch where the rail meets the steps, began to speak, not to crack, not to pop with cold. They groaned, the way wood groans when weight is placed on it, a slow, settling, structural sound, as if something of considerable mass was stepping up. One board, then the next. Elias looked at the porch glass. There was a pane set into the door behind him, and a pair of windows flanking it. And where the shadow's edge had drawn level with the glass, the surface was frosted. Not condensation frost, not the pretty crystalline frost of winter mornings. A flat, opaque white, like the glass had been breathing and forgotten to stop. He went inside. He will tell you he walked calmly. I believe him, in the way I believe most things that people tell me about that night. Not because I think they're lying, but because the body in extremity will sometimes find a terrible, borrowed calm. A stillness that looks like composure, but is actually the mechanism of shock doing its quiet, merciful work. He went inside and he turned on every light he had, every lamp, every overhead, the stove light, the bathroom fluorescent, which hummed at a frequency he normally found irritating, the particular high whine of an old tube ballast, a sound like a distant television tuned to nothing, but which that night he found he wanted very badly to hear. He turned it on and he stood beneath it and let it hum into him. The darkness did not come inside that night. But here is what I need you to understand, and this is the thing that Elias could not have known, that the settlers knew and built their habits around, that Murray and her bone tallow candles understood in her bones and her budget. The darkness of this hollow is not patient the way weather is patient, waiting for a gap, an opening, an opportunity. It is patient the way water in limestone is patient. It is patient the way stain is patient. In the 3 weeks that followed, Elias ran the lights as he should have been running them all along. Every flood, every lamp, every bulb, dusk to dawn without interruption. He called a supply company and had additional floodlights installed in the south wall. He wired them to a timer. He did everything correctly. He paid the full tax, and the darkness did not advance again. But in the morning, every morning without variation, there were places inside the house where the light seemed to fall wrong. Not dark places, not shadows exactly, just places where the light arrived and did not fully land. A corner of the kitchen where the overhead fixture cast its glow, and the glow seemed to stop a few inches short of the baseboard, leaving a margin that was neither shadow nor light, but something between them. A stretch of hallway wall, chest height, where his hand, when he ran it along the plaster, felt a faint and sourceless cold, as if the wall itself were breathing inward. The window glass, the panes that had frosted on that first night, was replaced twice. Each time, within 2 weeks, a faint opacity returned. Not complete, not total, just enough that looking through it felt like looking through gauze, or through water, or through old photographs of rooms that used to be. He had let the dark inside, not far, not deeply, but the hollow's dark, once it has crossed a threshold, does not retreat entirely. It thins, it spreads, it learns the shape of the rooms it has touched. Murray would have understood this. she would have nodded and reached for more tallow. The interest, she would have said. You let it take its interest. Elias still lives on the ridge. He does not turn the lights off anymore. Not ever. The power bill is what it is. He has made his peace with the cost, the way you make peace with any tax. Not happily, but with the recognition that the alternative is worse. He sleeps with 2 lamps on, both incandescent, the warm kind, the yellow kind, the ones that buzz almost inaudibly if you put your ear close to the shade. He says the sound helps. He says it is the sound of the hollow being held back, and that if he listens carefully, the buzzing is rhythmic, almost like a pulse, and he can let his breathing settle to match it. I believe him. I believe that is exactly what it is. Now, I want you to listen to your own lights for a moment. Whatever lamp you have burning, wherever you are, in your bedroom, in your living room, in whatever gentle space you have made for yourself tonight, listen to the hum of it, the particular frequency of it. That sound is not nothing. That sound is the filament and the current doing the oldest work there is, which is holding the darkness at the margin, keeping it thin and polite and back behind its border. You are paying your tax right now without knowing it, without thinking about it. The lights are on. The dark is where it belongs. In the morning, Lux Hollow will be just a name on a county map that most county offices have quietly stopped printing. And Elias will wake up and check every bulb, and the hollow will be where it always is, waiting, quiet, patient, at the edge of the light, where it knows to stay. Sleep well now. The light is on. That's enough. Sinking Creek doesn't flow like other water. It's thick, and it carries things from the deep caves. The old SIEVE-MAKER thought he could filter the evil out of the stream. He spent 40 years weaving wire to catch the unbelonging things. He caught something all right. But a sieve only works if you're on the right side of the wire. It's getting through. I can hear it in the mesh. That scraping, That slow, patient scraping. Elias Mull said, he said if you burn the sieve, it ends. But I can't reach it. It's been above me for I don't know how long. The fire won't. What is caught in a sieve is not gone. It is only held. Now, I want you to settle in. Pull whatever it is you pull over yourself at night a little closer. Not because what I am about to tell you will make you cold, though it might, but because a story like this one was always meant to be told in the dark, in the half place between wakefulness and whatever comes after. This is a Redacted Archives case file. This is the matter of Thomas Vance, antique restorer, formerly of Roanoke, Virginia. And it is the matter of a man named Elias Mull, who has been dead for 41 years, and who, depending on how you choose to understand the evidence, may not be entirely finished with the work he left behind. I am going to tell you this story slowly. That is not a warning. That is a promise. Thomas Vance was not a man who frightened easily. He spent 30 years handling the objects of the dead, the bureaus and secretary desks, the rocking chairs and hand-carved headboards, the things that people made and loved and left behind in attics and barns and smoke-darkened rooms. He had a particular fondness for joinery, for the way old craftsmen hid their intentions inside the wood, a secret drawer behind a false panel, a hollow space beneath a false floor. He liked finding those. He liked understanding how a maker's mind had worked. He was not by nature a man who lingered on what those objects might still carry. He will tell you that too. Now, in the present tense, as in, he is not that man anymore. The estate of Elias Mull came to Thomas through a probate attorney named Gerald Pitts out of Floyd County, who sent a paper letter, which Thomas found charming, describing the property as a craftsman's workshop and associated dwelling, contents intact, requiring assessment and sensitive disposition. Sensitive disposition. Thomas thought that meant breakable things. He packed accordingly. The property sat at the end of a gravel road that stopped being a road about a mile before the map said it should. The hollow it occupied had a name, Sinking Creek, that locals used with a specific flatness in their voice that Thomas did not understand until later. It was the kind of name that described what the land did, not what it was called. What it did. The fog came down from the ridge before noon. Thomas noted that, wrote it in his small notebook. Fog settled early, unusual for the season. He would later circle that entry with a red pen and write 2 words beside it. It knows. He was not by nature a man who wrote things like that. The farmhouse was old, not charming old, working old. The kind of old that has been repaired so many times the repairs are themselves old. The porch boards were dense with age, dark and close-grained, as though the wood had spent decades pressing itself down, making itself harder to see. The attorney had left a key under a ceramic frog beside the front step. Thomas noted the frog had been placed facing outward, away from the door. He would later understand why, and the understanding would not comfort him. The first thing Thomas registered when he stepped inside was the smell. Cedar. Old cedar, dry and sweet. And beneath that, limestone. The cold, wet smell of rock that never quite dries. The smell of caves, of places underground for longer than anything living can remember. And beneath even that, something else. Something he would later describe as the smell of a room where the window has been left open to the wrong kind of air. The second thing was the sound, or the quality of the silence, which is different from silence. This house had the ordinary hush of old structure, the creak and settle, the tick of pipes, but underneath it a hum, not mechanical, more like the sound of a large empty space when there is wind outside and you cannot find where it is getting in. A resonance, as if the house itself were a vessel for something moving through it. Shush, shush. That was the wind in the eaves. That part was ordinary. Thomas told himself that and went to find the workshop. A ledger was beneath the central work table, in a flat drawer flush with the apron, opened by pressing a specific knot in the wood. Thomas found it the way he always found things, by knowing where craftsmen kept them. It was bound in brown leather, worn pale at the corners. The handwriting was small and even, not a young man's hand, but not a shaking one either. A hand that had made many precise things and brought that precision to writing. The first entry was dated April 1962. The last, March 1983. Thomas sat down on the work table stool and began to read. Elias Mull had not been, in his own estimation, a craftsman of furniture or implements. He had been a craftsman of containment. The early entries were written as explanation, not to anyone specific, Thomas thought, but to himself. The way people write when they are trying to fix a thing in place with words. Elias wrote about Sinking Creek, about the quality of the air in certain narrow hollows in the Blue Ridge, where the ridges above converged at an angle the old families called a draw. Not geographic, the sense of drawing something in, of concentrating it. He wrote, "My grandmother called it the heavy air, She said it carried things. Not weather, not dust. Things that had been let go of and had not yet found a new place to be. She said the old sieve-makers built their frames to help the air sort itself, to hold the heavy things so that the rest could pass through. The mesh does not destroy what it catches. It holds it until the burning. Thomas read that and sat with it. Until the burning. The entries moved into craft. Elias wrote about materials with the specificity of a man who had spent decades learning what worked. Wire was too rigid. Woven reed grew porous over time. Horsehair held well. The pale membrane material Thomas had noticed on some workshop frames, Elias referred to only as drawn material. Thomas chose, reading it, not to ask himself what it was drawn from. He wrote about the frame carvings, the border patterns Thomas had taken for knotwork. They were not knotwork. Elias called them binding lines, patterns that reinforced the function of the mesh. Thomas looked up at the nearest sieve and noticed for the first time that the vine patterns moved always inward, always spiraling toward the mesh, never away from it. He went back to reading. The entries from 1970 onward were different. The earlier voice was composed, a craftsman explaining his practice. The later entries were watchful, careful. Thomas recognized the quality. He had seen it in diaries from other estates. The quality of a man who has started to feel observed. In June of 1972, Elias wrote, "The oldest frames in the workshop are nearing capacity. I have let them go too long. I will carry them to the ridge before burning. This is the proper way." In October of that year, the guest room sieve filled faster than any I have made. There is a quality to what it holds that I cannot describe except to say that it is willful. Most of what the sieves collect is passive, residual. This is not passive. In January of 1975, I have moved my sleeping to the downstairs room. I do not like what I hear from the guest room at night. It is a sound like patience, like something learning the particular feel of the mesh above a sleeping man. I am going to burn the guest room frame in the spring. Thomas turned the page. The next entry was dated November 1979. He had not burned it. Between January 1975 and November 1979, there were no entries at all. 4.5 years of blank pages, pressed flat by the closed ledger for decades. Pages that held nothing, said nothing, and were in their blankness the most frightening thing Thomas had yet encountered in this house. The November 1979 entry read, "I cannot carry it now. My back will not allow it. The frame is too heavy for one man without damage to the mesh, and the mesh must not be damaged before burning. What is in the mesh must come out only in fire." 3 more entries followed, short. The last, March 1983, was 4 words. "Do not sleep there." Thomas closed the ledger. He sat among the 47 frames while the fog pressed against the windows and the wind moved through the hollow with its patient shush, shush in the eaves. He thought about the guest room, about the sieve above the bed, the black walnut frame, the dense horsehair mesh, unburned since at least 1975, possibly longer. He thought about the metallic air, about what he had half heard the night before, in the space between sleep and waking, and told himself was the house settling. Then he heard it again, from upstairs, a sound like patience, a sound like something learning the particular feel of a mesh, a soft, rhythmic scraping, not frantic, not panicked, the scraping of something that has been at a task for a very long time and has become, over those years, extraordinarily skilled at it. Thomas Vance did not run. He has been asked about this. He says he did not run because he needed to understand. That is the part of him that spent 30 years with the objects of the dead. He needed to see the thing before he could decide what to do about it. He went upstairs. The guest room door was closed. He had left it open. He stood in the hallway for a long moment and listened. The scraping had stopped when he came up the stairs. The fog outside had thickened, pressing at the window at the end of the hall, soft and white and dense as wool. He opened the door. The room was as he had left it. Bed, quilt, nightstand, water glass, window closed, floor unoccupied, and above the bed in its black walnut frame, the sieve. He had looked at it the night before and seen horsehair mesh, dark with age. He looked at it now with what he knew, and he saw it differently. The way you see something differently when you have been given the right word for it. The mesh was dark the way a filter goes dark, not from aging, not from dust, from accumulation. 40 years of the hollow's heavy air passing through that room, through that mesh, leaving behind whatever the Blue Ridge collected in its draws and its close, fog-heavy places. 40 years, and no burning, and what was caught in that mesh was not passive, was not residual, was willful, patient, learning. Thomas stood in the doorway and understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives quietly and stays, that he had slept beneath it, that he had closed his eyes in this room while what was caught in the mesh above him did what it had been doing for 40 years, testing, learning. He could not see anything in it. That is important to understand. There was nothing visible, no shape, no shadow that resolved into a face or a hand. The horror of the sieve above the bed of Elias Mull's guest room was not visible horror. It was the horror of almost, the horror of the corner of the eye. At the lowest point of the mesh, where the horsehair had been stretched thinnest by years and weight, there was a distortion, a slight, patient bow, as though something were pressing gently, steadily from the other side, learning still the particular feel of the mesh above a sleeping man. Thomas did not sleep in the house again. He drove down the gravel road in the dark, in the fog, until the pavement had streetlights on it. He sat in his car under a streetlight for a long time before he called Gerald Pitts. His written assessment recommended the workshop frames be examined by a specialist before any disposition. He recommended the guest room frame be handled last, with particular care regarding transport. The mesh must not be damaged before the proper method of disposition has been established, he wrote. He did not write what the proper method was. Gerald Pitts did not ask. The property remains in probate. The guest room door, as far as anyone knows, is still closed. Thomas Vance is fine. He would want you to know that. He lives in Roanoke and has returned to his work with a different kind of attention to what the objects of the dead might carry. He sleeps with a window open. He does not fully explain why. He has spent the last 18 months researching the folk practice of sieve-making in the southern Appalachians, the tradition Elias Mull was working within, older than Mull himself by several generations. He found a reference in an 1887 letter from a woman in Patrick County to her sister in Roanoke that read, "Mama's sieve-maker burned the frames last month, and the hollow has been easier since. She says it must be done every few years, or what is held will learn patience. And patience is the thing you cannot reason with." Thomas underlined that sentence. He thinks about the sieve above the bed in the guest room, unburned for 41 years now. The slight bow in the horsehair at the lowest point of the mesh, the steady, patient pressure of something that has become, over those decades, extraordinarily good at waiting. And he keeps his window open, and he does not sleep beneath anything he cannot see.
This has been a Redacted Archives case file. Go carefully. Keep your windows open. And if you ever find yourself in a hollow in the Blue Ridge, in the fog, in a room with an old frame on the wall, a frame of carved black walnut and dense dark mesh, do not lie down beneath it. Whatever is caught in a sieve is not gone. It is only held.
He comes carrying a brass rod and a ledger, walking the mountain paths with eyes that don't blink. He doesn't want your land or your gold. He's here to measure the weight of what you've done in the dark. And if your house doesn't sit square with the heavens, he has a very specific way of leveling the foundation. The chains moved again. Third morning. Moved back toward the hollow. And there was something wet on the links. Not dew. Not rain. Something that smelled like the inside of a Bible nobody'd opened in 40 years. They tell the story different depending on which side of Grapevine Ridge you were raised on. North side folks say Arthur Penn Halligan was a good man, thorough, the kind of surveyor who drove his stakes deep and slept well after. Southside folks don't say much of anything about Arthur anymore. They just get real quiet when his name comes up. And they look off toward the tree line. And they find something else to talk about real fast. This is what happened. Or near enough to what happened that it makes no difference. Arthur Penn Halligan drove his truck up the switchback road to Grapevine Ridge on a Tuesday morning in October. Cold enough to see your breath. Warm enough in the sunlight that you could forget for a moment that winter was crouching just past the ridgeline. Patient as something old and hungry. He had his transit level, his measuring rods, his Gunter's chains, old ones, his father's, iron links worn smooth and silver from a lifetime of being dragged across limestone shelves and through creek mud. He had a thermos of black coffee. He had the deed description. He had his ledger. He did not have, as it would turn out, nearly enough of the right kind of understanding. The property was the Kessler parcel, 42 acres up on the ridge, bounded on 3 sides by national forest land, and on the 4th by the old Harlan Vance property, abandoned since 1987, gone back to the mountain the way Appalachian land tends to do, quietly, steadily, without apology. The pines had reclaimed the fence rows. The kudzu had taken the equipment shed. Whatever Harlan Vance had planted in his fields had long since been swallowed back into the earth, the way the earth swallows everything, given enough quiet time. Arthur wasn't there to worry about the Vance property. He was there to establish the corners of the Kessler parcel so it could be sold. Simple work, 2, maybe 3 days. He walked the property first, the way any good surveyor does. Just walking it, just feeling it, getting a sense of the land before you start asking it questions. The grass on Grapevine Ridge grew sideways. He noticed that right off. Not bent by wind. There was no wind that morning. Just that still, gray-bright Appalachian stillness that settles into the hollows and stays. The kind of stillness that has weight to it, presence. The grass was simply oriented, all of it leaning northeast, every blade, like a compass pointing at something just past the tree line. Like every living thing on that ridge had, over many years, made a collective and quiet decision about which direction mattered. Arthur wrote sideways grass in his ledger and kept walking. The ridge smelled like wet burlap and old pine, like limestone after rain, like the particular mineral damp of a place where water has been moving through rock for so long the rock has started to forget it was ever solid. That deep, ancient, cold smell that comes up from the ground in October, when the surface temperature drops and the earth begins breathing out what it spent all summer keeping down. He found the first boundary stone at the northeast corner. Standard enough, 18 inches tall, gray, set flush against a limestone shelf running like a spine along the upper ridge. He photographed it, flagged it with orange tape that immediately looked wrong against the gray-green of the ridge. Too bright, too synthetic, like a scream in a library. By noon he had 3 of the 4 corners established. The southwest corner was giving him trouble. According to the deed, it should have been at a specific distance and bearing from the northwest corner. But when he ran the line, he ended up in a stand of old hemlocks with no marker of any kind. The trees listing slightly, roots broken through the limestone in slow, decades-long catastrophe. All of them leaning northeast, the same way the grass did. He ate his lunch on the limestone shelf and felt the particular unease a surveyor feels when the land doesn't match what's written down. A puzzle itch, nothing more. He'd been in harder spots than this. He found the southwest cornerstone 40 feet from where it should have been. Not close, not off by an amount explainable by old equipment or transcription error. 40 feet. A full surveyor's chain and then some. And yet the stone was clearly original. The same gray limestone as the others. The same chisel marks from whoever had set the corners the first time, maybe 80 years ago. The same weathering, the same slow green creep of lichen up one side. He checked his instruments. He reran the measurements. He recalculated. The stone was 40 feet from where it should have been. He drove a stake where it should have been, marked a discrepancy, and packed up for the night. The second morning. Arthur slept in his truck. He woke before light, made coffee on a propane burner, and stood at the cattle gate looking up at the ridge in the blue-black pre-dawn. The ridge looked back the way ridges do, without expression, without mercy, with the vast patience of something very old. He walked up to his stake. The stake was gone. Not pulled out, not knocked over. Gone. The ground showed no hole, no disturbance, no evidence that anything had ever been pushed into it. Just solid ground. Sideways grass, leaning northeast. He walked to the southwest cornerstone and measured from it again. It was now 43 feet from where it should have been. He checked the other corners. Northeast, fine. Northwest, fine. Southeast corner. The stone was 12 feet closer to the center of the property than he'd flagged it the day before. There is a thing that happens in the mind of a rational person when they encounter something that should not be possible. A renegotiation. The brain presents alternatives. You measured wrong. You misremember. The light is different in the morning. The brain is generous with alternatives because somewhere very deep it understands that the thing it doesn't want to consider is sitting right there, patient as a cornerstone, waiting to be looked at directly. Arthur renegotiated for about 45 minutes. Then he walked to the northeast corner and crouched down and looked at it closely, the way he had not looked at it yesterday, because yesterday he'd had no reason to look closely at anything. He'd been doing a survey. He'd been doing his job. The stone was not limestone. It had the color of limestone, the gray, the slight layering, but up close in the flat October light, it had a texture that limestone doesn't have, a porousness that was less mineral and more cellular. The chisel marks he'd photographed looked less like tool marks and more like the marks left by something pressed or folded or grown into a shape over a very long period of time. He took his pocket knife and scraped gently at the surface. The material was soft, softer than any limestone he'd ever worked. It flaked in thin layers, not the crystalline layers of stone, but something fibrous, something organic. The color beneath the gray surface was not the white of limestone, but something darker with a warmth to it he did not want to name. He scraped a little more, and then he stopped. He was nearly certain the stone was made of compressed human hair. Arthur had found strange corner markers before. Creek rock, hand-poured concrete, old car parts. Once, in eastern Kentucky, a row of pig skulls on iron spikes, which the deed called the Old Combs Marker. with no further explanation. He was not an easily shaken man. He opened his ledger and went back to the deed description, reading it now with a care he had not given it before. Standard meets and bounds language, he'd thought. A kind of language you skim after 31 years. But there, in a passage he'd moved past without reading fully, were words that stopped him cold in the October morning. Bounded also by the established markers of survey as set by the SIN-SURVEYOR, which markers shall remain fast and true according to the nature of the debt carried by each corner, said debt to be reassessed at each generation, the boundaries to draw inward, or to hold as the debts are carried or resolved, the markers being of the substance of the debt itself, and the land to reflect the moral survey of the family contained therein, the SIN-SURVEYOR. In the old Appalachian folk tradition, a SIN-SURVEYOR was not a person. It was a practice, a reckoning. When a family had done something the community agreed was wrong, not criminal necessarily, but morally weighted, the kind of wrong that sits in the bones of a family and passes down through blood, a specific kind of elder would be engaged, someone who dealt in what they called moral geography. The land the family owned would be surveyed, not by instruments, but by debt. The boundaries would stay open and wide while the debt was manageable and close, slowly, steadily, measurably close, as the debt accumulated across the years. The markers would be made from the debt itself, from what the family had tried to bury, from the weight of the unresolved, pressed and hardened and set at the four corners of a property like a sentence that could not be appealed. He thought about the estate attorney's phrase, recently reduced to one member. He thought about what 42 acres of Appalachian Ridge could hold in terms of regret, in terms of the things a family buries when it has no other place to put them, in terms of weight that accumulates across generations when you never pay what you owe, when you just keep pressing it further down and trusting the earth to hold it. He looked at his measurements. The stones were moving inward, not fast, not violently, slowly, the way the earth moves when it has decided something and has all the time in the world to see it through. Arthur walked to the northwest corner. The northwest cornerstone was 40 feet inward from its deed position. He stood in the middle of what remained of the 42 acres and turned in a slow circle, the chain cold and heavy in his hands, the sideways grass pressing against his boots. He looked at the 4 stones and he calculated the rate, the trajectory, How long before the 4 lines converged at a single point? He did the arithmetic in his ledger, slow and careful, the way his father taught him. Don't rush the numbers. The numbers will wait. The numbers are the only honest thing out here. At the current rate, the 4 property lines would converge in approximately 6 days. At convergence, the property would have 0 area. Geometrically speaking, it would cease to exist as land, and anything surveyed inside the boundary when the lines closed. He thought about what the deed called the substance of the markers. He thought about the compressed fibers under his pocket knife. He thought about what a family across generations might bury in a ridge, and what the land had been doing with all of it, all this time, quietly, patiently, pressing it into stone and setting it at the corners, keeping the moral account the way no courthouse ever would. He thought about his truck. He walked quickly down the ridge, which is somehow more frightening than the quickening. His truck was at the gate. The gate was outside the current boundary. He hadn't staked the boundary at the road, just eyeballed it from the deed. The deed position was fine. He'd checked that corner yesterday morning. He hadn't checked it this morning. Arthur walked to the northeast corner. The northeast corner had moved. 30 feet inside the deed position. 30 feet inside where his truck was parked. He was a practical man, not given to folklore or rural mysticism. He had made the earth legible for 31 years. He had taken the vague language of old deeds and translated it into something precise and legally actionable and real. He understood, standing at the cattle gate in the thin October light, that the boundary line had passed through his truck while he was up on the ridge doing arithmetic. His truck was now inside the survey, like stepping stones across deep water. He thought about what happened to things inside the survey when the lines closed. He thought about the stone under his knife. He thought about the filing cabinet of Kessler family history that existed somewhere in courthouse records, in church ledgers, in the memory of old people on the south side of the ridge who went quiet when the name came up and looked off toward the tree line. He thought about what the SIN-SURVEYOR, whatever intelligence moved through 42 acres of Appalachian limestone and sideways grass and hemlock roots, was deciding about a 3/4-ton Ford pickup truck. Whether it had weight, whether it counted, whether the moral geometry of the place had a column for the tools of the men who came to sell what should not be sold. He stood at the gate. The truck was 40 feet up the driveway. The driveway was inside the survey. He left the truck. He walked 6 miles down the mountain to the paved road, and sat on the guardrail and waited. While he waited, he looked at his ledger and thought about the one member the Kessler family had been reduced to, and thought about what it meant that the estate needed settling, and thought about who had sent him up there and why, and whether the attorney in Lexington had known exactly what kind of survey he was asking for. A power company truck stopped. The driver asked no questions. He drove Arthur to a diner in Flat Rock, where Arthur ordered coffee and eggs and sat at the counter and did not speak for a long time. And when he finally did speak, it was only to ask for more coffee. And the woman who poured it looked at his face and did not make conversation. He left his ledger on the counter when he left. He never filed the survey. The estate attorney called 3 times. Arthur retired 6 weeks later, which surprised people who knew him, because he'd always said he'd survey until he couldn't walk the hills anymore, and he could still walk them fine. He just wouldn't go back to certain ones. The Kessler parcel sat unsurveyed and unsold. The Forest Service sent someone up eventually. A young woman with GPS equipment and satellite coordinates and all the precision that 30 years of advancement can provide. She came back after the first morning. She said her equipment kept reading the same coordinate for all 4 corners. She said the property, according to her instruments, had no area. She said the grass all grew sideways, leaning northeast, every blade, like a compass pointing at something just past the tree line. She didn't go back. Nobody went back. Some debts the ridge keeps. Some surveys close all the way. And some land, once it's decided to make a fist, doesn't open again. Curing tobacco is a slow process, heat and time. But in the barn at the edge of the property, the heat started coming from somewhere else. The leaves weren't drying. They were twisting into shapes that looked like faces. The dryer wasn't just curing the crop. He was preparing a bed for something that likes to stay warm. They were still up there. All of them. And one of them had turned its head toward the sound of the rain. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened inside that barn. I need you to understand that I am not a man who frightens easily. I grew up in these mountains. I have walked creek beds at 2 in the morning. I have put down animals I loved with my own hands and slept fine afterward. I tell you this not to brag, but because I want you to feel the full weight of what I am about to say. What was hanging in that tobacco barn was not leaves. It never was. My name is Elias Cutter. I am 53 years old, and until the autumn of last year, I had not set foot on my grandfather's property in Harlan County, Kentucky, in nearly 30 years. The old man, Harmon Cutter, my mother's father, had died in September. A Tuesday, I was told, quietly in his chair, the way men like him always seem to go, as if even death had to wait for an invitation before it came inside. There was no service. Harmon had outlived everyone who might have attended one. The estate fell to me by default. A paralegal from a firm in Lexington mailed me a manila envelope containing a deed, a hand-drawn map of the property lines, and a single handwritten note in my grandfather's script that read only, "Do not open the big barn after August." It was October when I arrived. Now I want you to picture the drive up. Not because the road itself matters. It doesn't, not really. But because the land does. Because the land in that part of Harlan County does something to you before you ever step out of the car. The trees grow close to the road in a way that feels intentional, like they leaned in over the decades and nobody ever pushed them back. The light comes through in long amber columns that look almost solid, and everything underneath them, the ferns, the creek mud, the old fence posts, everything is just slightly too dark. The farmhouse itself was smaller than I remembered. Funny how that works. You spend years building something up in your memory, and then you stand in front of it, and it's just a gray, clapboard house with a rusted tin roof and a porch that sags on one end. I walked through the rooms in about 20 minutes. dust, old furniture, a cast iron stove, a calendar on the wall from 1987 that no one had ever taken down. It was when I came back outside, when I turned around to get my bag from the truck, that I saw the barn for the first time. I say for the first time because I have no memory of it from my childhood. And that is strange, because it is not the kind of thing a child forgets. It sat at the far edge of the property, maybe 200 yards from the house, half swallowed by the tree line. 5 stories tall. That is not an exaggeration. 5 full stories of dark vertical plank siding, the boards warped and black with age and weather, fitted together with the kind of tight, overlapping construction you only see in old tobacco barns, built before men started cutting corners. Ventilation slats ran the full length of each story, narrow as knife wounds, angled slightly downward, and through them I could see nothing. Only a darkness so complete it looked almost purple. A tobacco barn, the old kind, the curing kind. The smell reached me before I had even crossed half the distance to it. Sweet. That is the first word that comes to you. Sweet. But wrong. The way something sweet becomes something else when it has been sitting too long in a warm, still place. It was the smell of dark-fired tobacco, yes. That deep, smoky, almost molasses-thick smell that clings to the back of your throat. But layered underneath it was something older, something vegetal and faintly wet and faintly not. I have thought a great deal since that night about why I went inside. I have turned it over the way you turn over a stone you already know has something unpleasant beneath it. The honest answer is that I thought I needed to. That there might be equipment inside worth cataloging for the estate. That the note said after August, and it was now October, and I told myself that meant the restriction, whatever it was about, no longer applied. I told myself a great many things. The door was a sliding barn door, the kind on a rusted iron rail, and it was heavy enough that I had to put my full weight into it. It moved with a long, low groan that seemed to come from the whole building at once, a sound less like metal and wood and more like a complaint, like something lodged deep in the chest of a man who has been breathing too shallowly for too long. Inside, the light was amber, not warm amber, the amber of old resin, of things preserved under pressure. It filtered through those ventilation slats in long, flat planes, and the dust motes inside them were so thick and so slow that watching them was like watching snow fall in a dream. They drifted. They did not hurry. Nothing in that barn hurried. The floor was packed earth, dark and dry as ash, and it made almost no sound under my boots. The walls on the ground level were lined with wooden shelving, old curing equipment mostly, iron hooks on wooden pegs, coils of wire, tin cups and glass jars, some filled with dark liquid I did not open, a rusted hand pump that connected to nothing I could see, and hanging from the rafters above, far, far above, rising up through all 5 floors of that massive structure, were the bundles, hundreds of them. They were the size of men. No, I did not think that then. That is the thing about the brain. It protects you. It looks at a thing it cannot process, and it finds the nearest acceptable explanation, and it holds on to that explanation with both hands. So what I thought in those first moments was simply that my grandfather had been a prolific farmer, that these were simply very large, very full bundles of tobacco leaves, hung the old way, in the old style, the way they used to cure whole stalks rather than individual leaves. They hung in rows along wooden rails that spanned each floor, strung with coarse rope at the top, and they were wrapped, or rather they had settled and compressed over time into shapes that were long and narrow and slightly swollen in the middle, the way a hammock looks when someone is lying in it. The outer layers were a deep, oxidized brown, the color of old leather, of creek bark, of the soil itself, and they were dry, so profoundly, impossibly dry, that standing beneath them felt like standing inside a clay jar with the lid sealed tight. The air did not move in that barn. I found the curing logs near the back of the ground floor, on a workbench that had been built against the interior wall. They were ledgers, the long, cloth-bound kind, 7 of them in a row, each one dated on the spine in faded ink. The oldest was from 1887. The most recent was from 1971. I opened the 1971 one first. The handwriting was my grandfather's. I recognized the long, sloping, lower-case letters, the way he always wrote his 9s as if they were small anchors. The entries were sparse and methodical. Dates, temperatures, notes on humidity levels inside the barn, remarks on the quality of the cure. But the thing was, there was no tobacco noted, no pound weight, no variety, no buyer, none of the commercial information that would ordinarily fill a working curing log. Instead, there were names, first names, only first names, 1 per entry, sometimes 2 if a given year had been, and here I am reading his exact words, so listen carefully. Fruitful, Earl, Damon, Roy, Carvis, Sula, Little Tom, Gid, and beneath each name a single word that he had written in a different color ink, as if he'd come back to it later. secured. I closed the ledger. I set it back exactly where I had found it. And then I stood very still in that amber light, with the dust motes drifting around me. And I listened to the barn breathe, because it did breathe in a way. The ventilation slats allowed just enough air movement that the bundles above, all those hundreds of bundles, shifted faintly in their ropes, not swinging, not swaying, just settling. Millimeter adjustments, the way a sleeping thing adjusts when it finds a more comfortable position. That is when I noticed the sound. It was beneath the settling, beneath the slow creak of rope and rail. It was a dry sound, papery and very faint, like the sound of a moth's wing dragged slowly across old parchment, like the whisper of something unfolding. I looked up. On the third level, through the gaps in the open plank flooring that allowed the heat to rise during the curing process, one of the bundles had changed its orientation. It had been hanging perpendicular to the rail, the way all the others hung. Now it was at an angle. The lower end of it had come slightly away from the main body, separated, spread open, and it caught the amber light differently than the others. There was texture there that had not been visible before. A seam, a crease, the shape of a jaw. I should have left the barn. I know that. I have known that every day since. But there is a particular cruelty in the way real fear works. It does not send you running the way it does in moving pictures. It pins you. It fills your legs with cold water and your mouth with the taste of copper, and it makes you stand absolutely still. Because the most ancient part of your brain has decided that stillness is the only armor it has left. And in my stillness, I heard the rain begin. October rain in Harlan County comes in sideways. It comes with weight. It began against the walls of that barn like 1,000 flat hands pressing all at once, and within moments it was seeping, not flooding, just seeping, through the gaps in the old board siding. A fine, cold mist of it. It touched my cheek. It touched the packed earth floor, and the floor darkened in small spreading circles, and the smell of sweet rot deepened and shifted and became something else entirely, became alive in the way the dry ground smells alive when the first rain finds it. And from above me, all at once, came the sound. Crackling. Not the crackling of a fire, nothing so bright or so quick. This was slower. This was the crackling of a thing that had been folded for a very long time, carefully straightening itself out. the crackling of paper, of dried skin, of a husk that had compressed over decades into a shape it was never meant to hold permanently, now remembering, in the presence of moisture, that it had a different shape underneath. The bundles were unfolding. Not all of them, not quickly. It was happening the way ice cracks in spring, in sequence, one triggering the next along the rail, a slow cascade of small sounds moving from one end of the barn to the other and back again. And as they opened, as those papery, desiccated outer wrappings peeled away from the shapes within, I could see them more clearly in the light that filtered up from the ground floor where I stood. They were thin, impossibly thin. The thinness of something that has had every drop of water pressed from it over years and years. Their skin, if you could call it that, was the deep brown of cured tobacco leaf, traced through with pale raised veins like the veins of a leaf held up to sunlight. Their arms, because they had arms, long and angular and folded against their sides like the wings of something roosting, were beginning to extend downward. Slowly, without urgency, the way roots grow, the way time moves. Their faces were the worst part. They did not have features exactly, not the way you and I have features, but there were suggestions. There were contours where eyes might have been, deep-set recesses in that papery, brittle face, and below them a thin, horizontal crease that parted slightly as the moisture reached them, and moved like a mouth deciding whether to open. And when it opened, when that crease parted, there was a sound from inside it that I cannot describe well in any language I have. It was the sound of something very dry being held near something very wet and wanting. It was the sound of pure, ancient thirst. My grandfather's note had said, "Do not open the big barn after August." August, the dry month, the height of curing season, when the air inside that barn would have been so desiccated, so hostile to moisture, that whatever process kept those things dormant would have held. When the humidity outside was at its lowest, when there was no rain to seep through the boards, when a man could walk inside that barn safely, if there was any safe way to walk inside it at all. October, the rain month, the wet month, the rehydrating month. I do not remember crossing the ground floor. I do not remember getting my hands on the sliding door or finding the strength to move it. I have only the memory of cold rain on my face and wet grass under my boots, and the sound, still audible even at a distance, even over the rain, even over my own ragged breathing, of papery, crackling things continuing to unfold in the dark above the ventilation slats. I drove for 4 hours without stopping. I have not returned to Harlan County. The property is listed with an agency that handles rural estate sales, and the attorney who handles the listing has been instructed not to describe the barn in the listing photographs. I told him it was for aesthetic reasons. He did not question this. What I think about in the nights when I cannot sleep, when the rain hits the windows of my apartment here in Cincinnati, and I pull the covers up and I lie very still. What I think about are the names in those ledgers: Earl, Damon, Roy, Carvis, Sula, Little Tom, Gid, and the ones in all the other ledgers. All the years between 1887 and 1971. Dozens of names, one per entry, one per year in the dry years, two in the fruitful ones. And the word he always came back to write in that different ink, as if it were an accomplishment. Cured. The barn had a capacity, is what I'm saying. A designed capacity. 5 stories. Hundreds of rails. Hundreds of bundles. And my grandfather kept meticulous records, the way a careful man always keeps records, right up until 1971, the year I later realized that he stopped taking in farmhands for the harvest season, the year the neighbors stopped seeing unfamiliar trucks on the county road that led to his property. The year Harmon Cutter became, by all local accounts, a solitary and somewhat peculiar old man who kept to himself and tended a farm that no one ever saw produce anything. He was not producing anything. He was preserving it. One thing I did not mention, because I have not been able to think about it clearly until now, here at the end of telling you all of this. One thing I did not mention is what happened as I was running across the field toward my truck in the rain. I looked back once. I know you're not supposed to. Every story and every instinct tells you not to look back. But I looked back, and through the ventilation slats of the uppermost story, the 5th floor, the one nearest the peak of the roof, I saw a shape that was pressed close against the slats, that had arranged itself close against the slats, that was tilting its contoured, papery, vein-traced face outward into the rain. And the slats, those narrow ventilation slats, angled downward, designed to let air move through without letting weather in. They were not designed, it seems, with everything in mind, because the shape on the 5th floor was opening its mouth and catching rain. Sleep well. The tape is running thin. The sun will be up soon. But the things we've talked about tonight, they don't disappear in the light. They just hide better. If you've made it this far, the hollow has let you go. For now. Close your eyes. Forget what you saw in the shadows. We'll be back in the archives soon. Until then, sleep safe, sleep deep.